LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. Does anybody watch this live on YouTube? If you're watching live on YouTube, please say hello. I don't know if that happens or not. I know we get some replays on there. So I want to welcome you to a very special episode of The Water Cooler because we are here with Robin Rosenberg, and she is absolutely amazing and fascinating. And like, if being a geek wasn't cool already, I would say she makes being a geek cool with all of her cool research that she does and current work. But I'm gonna give you the lowdown with her official bio. Robin Rosenberg is the CEO and founder of Live in Their World. She is a clinical psychologist and textbook author. She has had both psychotherapy and coaching practices in the San Francisco Bay Area and New York City. I would think both of those places would be fascinating to be in psychotherapy. She is board certified in clinical psychology by the American Board of Professional Psychology, a fellow of the American Academy of Clinical Psychology, and is an assistant clinical professor at the University of California, San Francisco. She has taught psychology classes at Lesley University and Harvard University. I think it's pronounced Harvard. Robin has been interested in virtual reality for years and was the lead author of a study to investigate using VR for good. She has combined her interest in immersive technologies with her coaching and clinical experiences to foster in employees a deeper understanding of how and why other people may feel slighted or marginalized and how to approach such interactions differently. What Robin doesn't say in this bio is her past research into superheroes, which is pretty cool. And I'm not going to harp on it too much, but we do have to talk about that too. But first of all, welcome, Robin. It's so nice to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me, David.
Of course. So you know the drill. We're going to jump right into this with a 6 in 60. And last week, we had Di Cirolo on, and she thought it was 60 seconds per question. So let's make that clear. It is 60 seconds total. Is that fair?
Totally fair. As long as they're yes/no questions.
All right, cool. And you all can play along wherever you're watching, from LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, wherever you're watching. You can play along right in the chat, and we'll see those pop up. And even if you're watching the replay. But first, here we go. 6 in 60. And Robin has not seen these questions.
No.
Robin, your past work involved the psychology of superheroes. If you could have one superpower, what would it be?
Teleportation.
Ooh, that's a good one. 2020 was a hard year. 2021 hasn't been much better. What was the best thing that you think will come out of this mess?
People clarifying their values.
Ooh, I love that. You are the CEO of Live in Their World, an organization that uses VR to help people see through the eyes of another, or maybe the other. If you could choose to live in someone else's world for one day, whose would it be? That's a deep one.
Well, if I could make decisions, Mark Zuckerberg.
Ooh, okay. Name one prominent characteristic of your favorite boss of all time.
Understanding.
We had Di Cirolo on last week when she shocked us all by revealing that she loved pineapple on pizza. You're from New York. Tell us, what's the best pizza topping?
Mushrooms, of course.
Really? Oh, and I thought we were friends.
Artichokes.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I like that. And final question. We're out of time. Final question. I promise not to dwell on this too much, but my son made me ask, as a expert in superheroes, what's your favorite Marvel movie?
Marvel, the first Iron Man.
Oh, that was the correct answer. That's awesome. Well, thank you. I think you did absolutely great. That was awesome. You do well under pressure. So I was hoping, and we've got some people chiming in. Hello. Yeah, you did, but you can watch the replay. It's always on there. So here's where I want to start this off. So live in their world. What is it? What exactly do you do there? What does your work look like?
Okay, so, well, those are three questions. Live in Their World is a company. It's my company. And what we do is we have different services. The original mission of the company, the service we provide, is to use what's called distributed learning or drip learning, which is learning in small doses over time, which is the most effective way to learn, um, to help people understand people who are different than themselves in some way, typically, race and gender, or ethnicity, but other ways as well, and uh, understand how disrespect can manifest, often unintentionally, and then upskill people for respectful engagement, because none of us is ever going to get it all right, ever. Right. And so we need to be able to talk to each other to learn and be better, to do better. So,
Yeah.
disrespect at work, whether it's DEI related or not, it costs employees and employers an enormous amount of money in a variety of different ways. So that's what we try to do. So we have that program. We do leadership training for inclusion and also for a hybrid workplace,
Mm.
because it's very complicated
Yeah.
to do that. And then we do executive coaching.
Great. So there's a lot there. You guys are doing some really cool work. So I love the drip learning piece, because those one and dones often aren't
Don't
enough.
work. They don't work.
Um,
Actually, I should
yeah.
say that, because you alluded to this before, that program, the drip learning program, in part uses virtual reality to literally put yourself in the position of people from different demographic groups, so you can really understand the lived experience of what it's like in situation after situation after situation. So I forgot to mention that.
That's really cool. That so I can put on this VR thing and live the life of a black woman. Is that right?
Correct.
So what does that
Correct.
mean? Live the life. Like what does that look like?
So for the VR portion of the program, you can have the VR experience in one of three ways.
Mhm.
One is an Oculus headset in the workplace, which was the original way, and then of course COVID hit, so we had to figure out work from anywhere. And then another way is what's called mobile VR, where you put your phone in one of these mobile headsets, and that's pretty cool. And you can do that from anywhere, and these are very cheap, inexpensive. And then what's called immersive video, which is like a YouTube 360, if any of your listeners or viewers have ever seen one of those. If not, you should definitely try one. They're kind of cool. You can move around a bit in the space.
That's
And
like that's like Google Maps. Like you sort of drag it around and you see all around you,
kind
like in the
of,
Street
but
View thing.
no, but it actually is from um, typically YouTube 360 is from the perspective of the person behind the camera.
Yeah.
So you can, look around and really feel like you're there. It's the easiest way that doesn't require any additional devices in order to have a VR experience.
Right.
But what we do is we really show you in scene after scene both what it's like,
Mm.
everyone has a story to tell, even white men, right? I mean, everyone is.
Right.
Um, but we really tried to explain, for instance, you mentioned a black woman, of their ways that black women are typically, often unintentionally, um, disrespected
Hmm.
or discriminated against. And, again, it comes in subtle ways typically. And so we're just trying to give people a sense of what that's like. But also,
Mhm.
how anyone in the situation can make a difference. So, for instance, I may be disrespected, right? I may have, maybe because of gender issues or just someone is a jerk, right? Could, who knows? Um, I have to figure out what am I going to do in that situation, right? And there are many possible options.
Right.
You're a bystander. You saw what happened and you recognized what was really going on. You have many options. What do I do? Right? There are many ways to handle it, especially if there's a group meeting. You do
Right.
it in private, you do it in public. You're the person who was unintentionally disrespectful. Someone brings it up to you. What do you do? Right? So what we're trying to do is upskill people for the what do you do part.
Right.
So it's both awareness and next steps.
So what would you do if you were in that person's skin, right? That which I think that
Right.
that would give you a different, you would get different feedback from the environment, right?
Totally.
As a very different example, I'm sure, like it's not as extreme, but I remember there was a time before COVID when I had lost a whole ton of weight. And like first time in my life, I was at my ideal weight, and I started noticing that I was offending people because when I was fat and jovial, like people loved my jokes. And when I was looking a little bit trimmer and whatever, people were taking offense to it. So it was like suddenly I was in a different body and people were reacting differently. I can only imagine that that would
Totally.
be magnified if the color of my skin changed or my gender changed.
Totally. And that's really what we're trying to go for with the VR experience. It's show not tell, if you will. You know, the whole thing in
Right.
writing is you want people to just feel it.
Yeah.
And we're trying to help people both know and feel.
Right.
And so they're motivated. My view is ultimately we want respect in the workplace. We want inclusion in the workplace to be habits, right? It just makes everyone's work life better, right?
Right.
If we're decent people to each other,
Yeah.
and but sometimes we don't know what that means because we're all different,
Right.
right? And so some people might find your jokes hilarious, and some people might find them incredibly disrespectful,
Right.
and we only learn right when we through feedback. And so how do you do that, and how do
Right.
you give people help people have an open and curious mind, wanting to learn and wanting to be a good colleague.
Right. Right. So it's kind of like, to me it sounds almost like a one of those personality assessment exercises where everybody's different, like on steroids, where you're actually stepping into a different experience. I always say like there's so many of those personality assessments that I don't name them anymore because that never
Yeah.
goes well, but that might not be incredibly valid or externally validated or anything. But
Yes.
I tell people if you can do a Disney princess quiz, the underlying message of, oh, I'm a Jasmine and there are also bells, like I
Interesting.
think that in itself is important. So I guess what I'm getting at is this is actually putting you in a different experience.
Yep.
So if it doesn't, it sounds to me that it would not need to be that I'm having, um, you know, conflict in my workplace between black women and white men, even if there were no black women in my workplace or no white men in my workplace, it would maybe carry over. Is that correct?
Right. That is correct. We have an underlying curriculum of what does respectful engagement look like? Um, the specifics of things to be mindful of might be different for black men versus Asian American women
Right,
versus right different LGBTQ. So you want to have the specific awareness for different demographic groups, But fundamentally, again, we're never all going to get it right, and all people from a given demographic group aren't the same, right?
Right.
We have different sensibilities even within the same demographic group, and so this is where it's important to just be able to have conversations, and that's become harder and much more freighted. So we're trying to make that um, more possible. It's
Yeah.
sort of anti-cancel culture, if you will, of just
Right.
how do we figure out how to be decent colleagues to each other, um, whoever we are, and be inclusive because it's the right thing to do. It's good for the company, and it just makes our work lives better.
Right. Right. Now, you just said something really interesting about, on one hand, it's really important to understand the collective experiences of let's say, Latino men, right? Or something of that nature, right?
Right.
But also, it's important to understand that there is diversity within the diversity. I think a lot of
Correct.
times we end up classifying, oh, I understand what it is to be a black woman. I watch a ton of CNN. I know,
Exactly.
and like, and
Right.
so then when you are in an interaction with somebody from whatever group that is, you just sort of jump into it, and now you're just loading the conversation and the expectations down with your own stereotypes.
Correct.
So is that a danger of this? And how do you overcome that? Like, what does that look like?
Right. So it is a danger. I mean, I think that's awareness is a better danger than lack of awareness.
Yeah.
If you have to choose,
Right.
but I think it's awareness plus, which
Correct.
is not. It's about assumptions, right? And don't. You can have awareness, but don't make assumptions that they apply. Group data applied to an individual is always risky.
Right.
Um, for people in social sciences, and so it's the same here. It's good to know what the prototypical or typical experience is for people from a given demographic group and the types of challenges that they face, but then don't assume that that's 100% accurate for a given individual, right?
Right.
And so in order to learn about that individual's experience, you have to be able to talk with them. And so that's the upskilling part of how do I approach these conversations, and if someone approaches me, how do I respond, right?
Right.
And so that's really so there's awareness, but then conversation.
Right. Right. To open up dialogue. I think that that's incredibly
Yeah.
important.
Yeah, especially with remote. I mean, we're all so isolated, and it's a way of engaging, water cooler conversation,
Mm.
and really knowing and trusting each other, right? Of just feeling connected when we're feeling really isolated and disconnected. And as we start changing jobs,
Right.
and if to the extent that we're remote or they're remote, we don't really know our colleagues. We don't have these incidental water cooler, coffee area conversations,
Right.
and it's much harder. So I think it's a nice. Our experience has been it's good water cooler conversation, and we collect data because I'm a psychologist, and our goal is to actually move the needle. So, um,
Right.
but I think in a even post COVID and post COVID world, it's what are the opportunities for meaningful connection with each other, and learning, and building trust, and just enjoying the people you work with.
Right. Yeah, and I want to get back to what that is, that going to remote and telework and hybrid environments, and what that has done, and what the continuing challenges are going to be like. So we're definitely going to come right back there. But and I'm not trying to label you, but
Label
you
me. Go
might be a
ahead.
white woman, right?
Yeah.
So as a white woman, how do you go about designing these things for people who are not like you, and how do you collect the experiences to
Got
sort of
it.
put into your programs?
Thank you for asking. That's a great question. One of the things that is super important to me is authenticity of the lived experience that we provide. So I collaborate with people
Yeah.
from each demographic group because I would never presume to know.
Right.
And so I find sort of the right people, um, and then actually once we have the materials, we vet them with a kind of kitchen cabinet of people from that
Mm.
demographic group,
Yeah.
because again, everyone's experience is different even
Right.
within the same demographic group. So we kind of crowdsource, if you will, from a variety of people.
Right.
And Latinos are a good example because, depending on when they or their family members came over, from what country they came, under what circumstances, that creates a difference, right? And so, there are regional differences, whatever your demographic group. I mean, that's a whole other demographic group, right? If you grew up Southern versus if you grew
Yeah.
up in Southern California. So, right. The most important thing is the authenticity of the lived experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I would think so. And I love that you take it to this diverse group of people, and I can only imagine what that's like with people saying, "Yup, you got it on the nose," and that's not my experience, and
Exactly.
having to play
That's really
off that.
important,
Yeah.
right? If it's only, people of Cuban descent whose parents or grandparents came in
Right.
1960, that it won't work. So, yeah.
Right. Right. Okay. So now going back to the experience that we can't escape, which is 2020
Yeah.
and COVID. Um, so people went back away from the workplace, and I would have expected maybe that as people went to their homes and they're behind a computer screen, that maybe this would be a good thing for diversity and inclusion and equity in a lot of different ways if your whole office is at home. However, I recently came across a survey that showed that there were a lot of these microaggressions and things that it seemed that a lot of this stuff was actually ramping up. It was becoming a bigger issue for a lot of people. These subtle forms of
Right.
racism and sexism. Um, is that have you seen any of this, and do you have anything that would explain that phenomenon?
Um, so yeah, that's apparently common. The research is that just because we're remote, the usual dynamic didn't change.
Right.
It could, but it didn't. I don't know why it would, right? Because you need to upskill people and tell them specifically what they should be doing differently. So if you're not telling them specifically what to do differently, they wouldn't know, or and you're not incentivizing them. So typically there are some things that got worse depending on the type of leader. So when you think about performance reviews or promotion, if you're a boss who's used to seeing who's staying late or who comes early or how much time they spend on the phone, or you know how
Right.
much time they spend in the coffee area, that's part of the conscious or unconscious metric that you may use
Right.
that feeds into your performance evaluation or decisions about promotion. When everyone is remote, you don't have those cues,
Right.
right? They're gone. Now, whether those were fair cues or not is a separate issue. But whatever cues you were using that fed into your decision making, you have to have new cues. And so there's been a whole thing about trusting your employees
Mm.
during remote.
Right.
Um, there are people who may not talk a lot in meetings. In a remote world, they are severely handicapped, because how will your boss know you're contributing
Right.
if you're not? So there are all kinds of amplifications. I'm not even talking about the obvious stuff like interrupting in meetings or being dismissive,
Hmm.
or poo-pooing someone, or the usual overlooking when someone says something and then a white man says the same thing and everyone's like, oh, that's a great idea. I'm not talking about all of that stuff.
Right.
It's more, that's, of course, that's just going to continue, and it may even be more rampant in a Zoom world because the loudest voice kind of gets the floor.
Hmm.
And so if whoever's leading the meeting doesn't do a really good job, or whoever's deputized to moderate
Right.
isn't doing a good job of moderating, it really becomes a free for all if there isn't a structure.
Right.
Uh,
Right. So that's I remember when I started in the business college, because I started over in biology and the natural sciences, and I like biology, chemistry, physics, not for me. Um, but when I finally made it over to the business building, the very first class I had in business, before I learned any sort of skill set or anything in this management 101 sort of class,
mhm.
the professor, who was a retired executive from a big firm, he said to us, "Here's the number one tip: get in with the power core."
Right.
That was his number one tip. And, looking back, it's very clear what the majority of that class looked like and what the majority of the power core looked like, right? And so there's already proximity bias, right? That we're,
Right.
when you're in with them and going golfing with them or whatever, then you can rise to the top regardless of your skill set, right?
Right.
But also, if I look like you, I probably have similar experiences and whatnot, and that'll help me rise to the top. So you would think that when people went behind the screen, that would help with that, but it just introduced more
Well,
problems.
yes and no. I mean, to the extent that people were lived near geographically. I mean, I'll give you an example in New York,
Yeah,
right? So there was a mass exodus of certain people to to their second home in the Hamptons,
yeah, right,
right? And which is, that's fine. Um, but if you are in a position to have a house in the Hamptons, you can meet with your boss in the backyard,
right,
right? And so you have proximity,
yes,
and versus if you're in a studio apartment with your intimate partner and both of you are trying to work from home, it, one of you basically takes calls in the bathroom
right,
or in the closet, and is that, I don't see that as really leveling the playing field.
right,
And so, interestingly, I've heard from a number of people that are hybrid or sort of have offices open for people who want to use them,
yeah,
that the people who are coming in are younger people
hmm,
who don't have great work arrangements at home.
right,
And so the office is better than home. And so that's its own inequity,
yeah,
right? Or if you are working from home but you don't have extra money for a good printer or for good bandwidth, and the company's not, I mean, it sort of multiplies out.
right, right. So I think you're like this. That I saw this large scale study. They found that women did not want to go back to the workplace, as I think like 50%. They were 50%
Right.
more interested than men in terms of returning to the physical workplace. Um, but what what they also found, and it was sort of like a side note in the paper, was that men with children under the age of 18 wanted to go back to the workplace more than anybody. And that makes a lot of sense to me as a man with children under the age of 18, but it
Right.
shows those disparities within the home.
Exactly. That's exactly what it shows. And so for women, again, we're going to do the typical, the
Yeah, right.
stereotyped couple,
Yeah,
that it made their life easier to be home because it made pickup easier, or babysitting falling through easier, or school holidays. But um, and then women are expected to do double duty, and then for men they get to be at work and fully concentrate on work.
yeah,
Again, these are gross generalizations. There are many women who want to go into the
right,
office for the same reason.
right.
So, lest we paint the brush, but we know that COVID has been much harder for women in the
Yeah,
workforce, and women have left the workforce because it was just too hard to do what their bosses were asking of them, um, and deal with all the COVID fallout,
Yeah.
of homeschooling. Somebody has to do it.
Right. Right. So we have a question that came up here. Um, the question is, we're in this spot right now. Where do you see us in the next 10 years? And I think I came across this other piece where between March 2020 and June 2020, the amount of patents that mentioned work from home or telework or remote work doubled between March and June
That
2020. So
I
where do we
totally
go
would.
from here?
So, this is the $24,000 question or $64,000 question. I think it's very hard to say now. I think some people, if you're an extrovert, right, I think those people really want to go back to if not their office, then a WeWork or
Right.
something where they're not working from home alone, if they're home alone, which I totally get. Um, there is, the other thing is people want to be where the power center is. And so to
Right.
the extent that bosses are in the office, there's this pull for particularly ambitious people to
Right.
want to be at the office for FaceTime, and proximity. Um, you know, Collaborative work is harder, or has been harder. We haven't found a way to crack that nut reliably.
Right.
There are all kinds of solutions. Where do we go in 10 years? In 10 years, people may want to be back in the office full time with the option to be flexible. Meaning if I don't feel so hot, or it's like not a big deal to work from home on a given day, as long as you're not crucial for collaborative meetings, right? So it may be that there's some hybrid. It's expensive for offices, for office space. So employers who may want to do remote. Honestly, we don't have enough data yet, and it's going to depend on the industry or
Right.
even the type of job that you have,
Yeah.
regardless of industry. In 10 years, we'll know a lot more about the cost trade-offs, time trade-offs, innovation trade-offs. I think we don't know, and we're all just trying to collect data in our own companies,
Right.
right? And see what works. And the deprivation we've all experienced over the last year and a half skews what we want now,
Hmm.
and then it's going to be hard to know 10 years from now.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, so we just went 10 years into the future. I want
Yeah.
to go a couple years into the past.
Okay.
And I want to know your story. And I usually start with the origin story. So you think with the superhero lady, I'd start with the origin story. But, I really wanted you to first talk about what exactly it is, this work that you're doing. And after we started on that, how could we move away from that?
Sure.
But at this point, how do you get to this spot? Because this is a really interesting place to be, where you're in the you're involved in the marriage of two different sorts of avenues, technology and psychology. How did you get
How'd
here?
I get here? Um, Roundabout is the answer.
Yeah.
So I write psychology textbooks, and I had been certified in hypnosis for my clinical practice. And there's a thing in hypnosis, if any of your listeners have ever been hypnotized, called dual consciousness or divided consciousness. And that's where, on the one hand, you hold the reality of what you're experiencing in trance, but
Yeah.
you also know you're sitting in my office, which is why sometimes it feels like you're not hypnotized,
Right.
right? You hold both of those. About 25 years ago, and so I just found that fascinating, that dual consciousness. 25 years ago, I started reading in the academic literature about immersive virtual reality.
Hmm.
And what they described blew me away, because it was the same dual consciousness. It was, you have the reality of what you're experiencing in the headset, but you're in a headset,
Right.
right? And so you're holding both. And I just thought that was really interesting. I follow the literature. Turns out in neuroimaging, brain scanning studies, both hypnosis and VR are similar also in the way that your brain registers the experience as real, right?
Mm.
It sort of fakes out your brain a little bit, which is why they're both effective
Right.
for in the purposes that they're used. Um, and so I just was really fascinated. And there's a researcher at Stanford, Jeremy Bailenson, whose work I followed for a long time. And I went to a talk he gave, and I told him I was his biggest fan.
Mm.
And I was moving to California, so he said, when you get there, let's meet. And he was really gracious and generous. And so we collaborated on a couple of studies, one of which you mentioned at the beginning. And this happened, I was working with him around the time that Trayvon Martin was killed and George Zimmerman was acquitted, and that led to Black Lives Matter. And that led some white people to say, all lives matter or white lives matter. And again, I don't presume to know the lived experience of being Black in America, but I had thought that I knew enough to hypothesize that this was a profound failure of understanding.
Mm-hmm.
That they just didn't really understand the difference in the lived experience. And because, sort of like peanut butter and chocolate, because I was in VR, doing research in VR, I thought, wow, here's this tool that can really give people the understanding on steroids,
Right.
right? That you can, it's not just actually walking in their shoes, which is one thing, right? It's one thing to walk in someone's shoes, but it's actually walking in their feet
Right.
is the analogy that I make.
Mm.
And so, because when you're walking in someone else's shoes, you're still you,
Right.
right? This is walking in someone's feet where you're them.
Even deeper. Yeah.
It's even deeper. And that's what our research shows, that it's really a much deeper emotional learning experience that we then pair with cognitive learning and sort of explicit learning. So that's how it was an idea. I mentioned the idea to a venture capital guy that I socialized with because I lived in San Francisco at the time, and of course they're on every street corner.
Right.
That's a joke. That's a joke. But I mentioned the idea. He thought it was an interesting idea, but I had a day job I loved, and then after Me Too, he contacted me and said, "Remember that idea you had? We'd like to
Hmm.
fund you to do a proof of concept study on gender." So we did that, and we got great results. And the comments from the participants blew me away. And I felt like if I can move the needle on this,
Yeah.
wow, what an opportunity! Talk about mission, right? Mission and purpose and
Yeah.
meaningful work. So that's how I got here.
That's amazing. So you've been doing a lot of this work because you did the superhero stuff too. Sorry, I had to go back. You can't just
That's okay.
what was that Seinfeld thing? Da da da. What's the I forget what it is. But you just sort of skipped over that piece. But that seems to have a connection too because it's people living in somebody else's experience in the same way.
Ah, got it. So a bunch of years ago, I um, was writing a psychology textbook, and I was asked to contribute to a book on the psychology of Harry Potter.
Hmm.
And I wrote a chapter about what does Hogwarts actually teach at a sort of overarching level. And I just had a really fun time doing it. I thought it was just a blast. And the same publisher um, was doing psychology of superheroes. And I actually had thought, because I was writing an intro psych textbook for college students, and I thought, it might be fun to talk about intro psych from a perspective of Superman and Batman. It was just a weird. I had three little kids,
It's
and
fun.
they
Yeah.
were into superheroes, so that was why it was on my mind. But so they reached out to me, and I ended up editing that book, and the kids, it's sort of not exactly a family project, but they helped, and it was interesting, and it was a way we talked about all kinds of
Yeah.
superheroes and psychology, and they introduced me to X-Men, which is, oh my gosh, there's so much psychology in there. It was just waiting to be
Yeah.
pulled out, if you
Right.
will. And that is my mission, is really to use nuggets of scientific psychology to just help improve people's lives. So that's kind of how I got into the superhero stuff. In fact, there's an area of research called post-traumatic growth or stress-induced growth. And Batman is the poster boy for the actual trajectory of how people make meaning of adversity. I
Interesting.
mean, it's just the
Yeah.
two-page original origin story just lays out what the research shows. It's amazing,
Wow.
right?
That's
Which
a dark
is
story. That's a
it's a dark story, but it, to the extent that he made meaning from this
right.
horrible thing that happened to him,
Yeah.
right? I mean, when we have significant adversity, people, especially if it's personal, people say, "Why me? Why did this happen to me?"
Right.
Versus the pandemic happened to everyone in the world, so that's a little different.
Yeah.
Um, but and so we try to answer that question of why did this happen, and the answer that it's random,
Yeah.
that bad things happen, and it is terrifying
Yeah.
because we want to have some control. Like, well, where was she walking, right? Or where
Right.
did they go? Because then I'll know. And it's an illusion of control
Right.
because it's really scary to have no control. So all of our foundational beliefs about ourselves and the world get challenged if
Yeah.
there's nowhere safe. If I can't protect myself, if I can't protect my family, how do I go on?
Right.
And so that's the transformation of
I love that. I've never thought of that in that way, but that's absolutely right on. I mean, that's what he did. He took ownership of it and control of it. That he was going to make the world this better place. And that, you were talking about how we, say, well, where was she walking or whatnot.
right,
And I know that that's always the first question when somebody passes away. How do they die? Right? And it's
right,
almost like a
right,
selfish pursuit.
totally.
Like, oh, good, because my heart's good. That I
Right,
got that
exactly.
checked out
I know
recently.
what not to do.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
What was their lifestyle like?
Right.
Did they eat high fat, whatever, So it's this illusion of control, which I get. I mean, it's,
Yeah.
very adaptive for humans. But when that's challenged, when you experience, you or someone in your family experiences, real trauma or significant adversity, the you can't believe in the control anymore
Yeah.
because when bad things happen to good people, what do you do?
Right.
How do you negotiate that? So that's kind of how it started. The superhero stuff is a way of just teaching. That's an example of just scientific psychology of the
Right.
research on post-traumatic growth and the process of that. But
Yeah.
there's all kinds of things of just Wolverine's memory issues and sort of what do we know about it's an opportunity to teach about memory,
Yeah.
right? And identity. So anyway, that's
I
how it
love
happened.
I love that. And then you sort of got into escapism, I guess. Is that what it is? Like sort of putting on the mask, which then ended up being addiction,
Oh, yeah.
right?
So we yeah, so I did my own research with people who attend comic conventions, and that was also really interesting. And that is actually dovetailing, trying to understand people's experiences,
Hmm.
because often the people who engage in what's called cosplay, costume play,
Yeah.
are introverts, shockingly,
Mm.
and a significant number of them, not necessarily a majority, and but yet here they are, in essence saying, look at me," and you would never know they were an introvert. So it sort of taps into this other side of them. And I was interested. There was some research about wearing masks. This was before the pandemic. The What's the effect of wearing masks, and does it make you feel more like yourself or less like yourself? Does it make you more or less inhibited? And so I was just curious about people who cosplayed. So I was interested in understanding the effect of a mask.
Yeah. I'm always fascinated when I see, actors get up and take their Emmy or Oscar or whatever, and they just look so uncomfortable up there. Like some of these like movie stars that are uncomfortable with public speaking, with being in front of a crowd, but then you put like makeup on them and they're playing a different character, and suddenly they're completely comfortable. Because they can be
So
that other
yeah,
person.
so that's an interesting bridge to the executive coaching work, because Often when people have a new role, like, I don't know if you remember your first job, right?
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
you're kind of like, you're pretending,
Right. Right.
right? Because even if you know the job in a new role or in a new company, you're still pretending.
Yeah, we
And
speak about
so,
imposter syndrome on here a lot. That's
exactly,
right. Yeah.
exactly. But that's the interesting thing, is that we know from a lot of research on cognitive behavioral therapy, which is that when you behave, I'm going to say it differently, but in a new role, when you behave in a new way long enough, it becomes a part of you, right? So for people who are new parents, you don't know what it means to be a parent, really. It's not your
Right.
identity, or if you're promoted, you do it long enough and it actually does become a part of your identity. For the imposter syndrome, the issue is, well, can you own it,
Right.
right? Because you're living it. The data are there,
Right.
right? If you're doing a decent job, you may feel like an imposter because you're not acting like one, right? And no one else is seeing you that way. And then it's really just an internal issue, not just, but it's an internal issue to have how you see yourself align with all the external data.
Right. So almost like a focus issue that you need to
Yeah.
see what you're, because I know when you're hit with imposter syndrome, and generally just with our negativity biases like that we just, the things that when we screw up, that's what stands out. Right. And
Right. We
so,
over focus on our screw ups.
right,
Exactly.
exactly, right. I think that's what it says in the literature. Over focus on our screw ups. That exactly.
Right.
but but right. So when Juanita asked about putting make what kind of makeup can introverts put on? So what does that look like? That's I mean, just focusing on the stuff that's on the accomplishments.
So introverts. So let me just tease out a number of different things. So
Yeah.
then so people who are introverts are not necessarily people who are shy,
Right.
um, which is a totally different thing than imposter syndrome. So I'm going to put imposter syndrome to the side for now.
Yeah.
We can come back to it. Introverts, whereas extroverts get energized by other people, introverts get drained,
Right.
right? So that's the sort of hallmark between the two.
Yeah.
Shy people um, may or may not be drained or energized, but it's harder for them to put themselves forward, if you will, to uh, be the focus of attention.
Hmm.
And so the question asked about introverts, and many introverts can do the social things that are required,
Right.
right? Because it's required. It's just draining. At the end of the day, they're
Right.
kind of they're not
Right.
like, that was so great. We got to spend all day
Yeah.
together.
They're tired.
Right? They're kind of like, oh
Yeah.
my god, I need to just go home and be by
Right.
myself.
Read a book.
Right? Exactly. So introverts tend to gravitate toward jobs that don't require gobs of social interaction,
Yeah.
except when they're promoted into a managerial or leadership role, and
Right.
then it can be challenging. I think that uh, I, I'm reading between the lines about what the question was asking. So I think that shy people tend not to say a lot at meetings, or they're very hesitant, or they say it in
Hmm.
a minimal way with a big question mark at the end.
Right.
Um, the One of the nice things with remote is about the chat function, right? So people can contribute via chat if they don't want to literally speak up.
Right.
Um, Leaders should absolutely be distributing the agenda in advance of a meeting and not right before, because for two reasons. One is, for everybody, it ideally gives them a chance to really think about the issues. You have to have an
Yeah.
agenda that's a well done agenda, but so you're not just getting off the cuff responses from people, but they can really think about it. It also gives people who don't like to speak up at meetings a chance to even tell you before the meeting. So an idea or an opinion can be then discussed by everybody else. It can be raised in a way that's more comfortable.
Yeah.
That said, if for people who identify it as an issue and want to work on it, about speaking, it's a version of performance anxiety typically.
Right.
Some coaching or some therapy. They're really easy ways. You can go to Toastmasters, it's called.
Yeah.
Toastmasters.com is really about helping people learn public speaking, but it's exposure therapy. I mean, there are all kinds
Yeah.
of, they're great self-help books for social anxiety. So it really, I'm reading into what the question was.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
I think that's the way I saw it too. That somebody who's really uncomfortable, but trying to move past that. And I completely agree with you in terms of Toastmasters. I am an ex Toastmaster, and I
Wow.
always love those things because you had budding professional speakers, and you had people who struggled to speak in front of the room, people with really impactful stutters and things like that were there specifically to become comfortable and to
Wow.
practice. Yeah, and I love that everybody could be in that same room together and be, you know, giving speeches in front of each other.
So you're a success story.
What's that? Me?
Yeah,
Of Toastmasters? I never graduated Toastmaster. I just moved up a
but you
little bit.
went.
Yeah, I did go. I did go.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I know a lot of speakers, they're talking about the difference between introversion and extroversion and being shy. And I know a lot of speakers who get up on stage and do their thing and they absolutely love it. And then they just need to go right back to their hotel room. Like they don't want
Right.
like the
Right.
all the people coming up to them afterwards. They like try to escape and just get back to their hotel room.
Right. I mean, it's a task to be done.
Yeah.
If you're an introvert, obviously, you have to think about if you are, offered a job that requires a lot of social stuff,
Right.
whether you want it, or if you do, then how you can do that in a way that's least taxing.
Yeah.
Typically, one-on-ones are easier than group meetings.
Right.
Um, you know, it, there are a lot of ways to deal with it,
Yeah.
but you have to be motivated.
So this has been great because I love the theme. Every time like I brought something up, you're like, oh, that, like, you don't even remember this stuff. Come on, this is good stuff. But like, I love the theme in that your professional career has taken because I think you said something about sort of stumbling into VR, but really, I see the thread. Everything you've done is about these different realities and
Yeah.
being in somebody else's shoes or feet or costume, right? And I
Right.
think it's so empowering.
As a clinical psychologist, when I was learning to do therapy and then with coaching and even the leadership training, what my superpower is, in fact, being able to put myself in other people's shoes and feet.
Yeah.
So it's funny that you say that because that is one of the things that I'm really good at.
Yeah, that's great that you're not just good at it, but you're good at teaching other people to do it.
Well,
Because I
that's
know some people can be real empathetic and be able to sort of take the perspective of somebody else, but the struggle and the challenge of they don't understand how others can't do that, right? So it's hard to sort
right.
of teach it.
It is very hard. And and for some people it's a harder lift than others.
Yeah.
But that's the thing about then talking to people, because then you don't have to imagine what's like in their shoes or their feet. You can ask them.
Right. Right. Yeah. And people like to talk about themselves. So you start asking the
Yeah.
questions and people will share.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
that's super empowering. But
Yeah.
especially in today's environment where sometimes it feels uncomfortable to ask about certain things and
Right.
uncomfortable, the fact that you just give them an avenue to explore, and that's
Right.
sort of putting in the effort that's necessary to sometimes start the conversation.
Right. It's creating the guardrails.
Yeah.
I like to say, there's good conflict and bad conflict.
Yeah.
I actually like to convert the word conflict to conversation,
Hmm.
because conflict has a lot of bad meaning for
Right.
many people.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, I don't want conflict. But it really is, the goal is to understand each other.
Right.
Right. And that's a conversation. When
Right.
people disagree about a product, at work or anything,
Right. That's
about
great. But
vaccines,
yeah.
anything. It's about, how do we have a respectful conversation where we
Yes.
may, in the end, still disagree, but at least we understand where the other's coming from, and it comes from a thoughtful place,
Right.
right? Or it didn't, and then they revise, or they find a reason. But we may still disagree, but can we find a way to respect each other in that?
Right.
And
And
but we need the guardrails for those
right.
conversations.
Yeah. I love all of this, Robin. This has been absolutely amazing. And how can people get in touch with you besides for clicking on your forehead right there?
That's so cool. That's really cool.
Well, we had to have some technology here. You're the VR queen, so
That's really cool. You can find me at liveintheirworld.com and just click contact us.
Yeah.
We also always have a free download. So right now we have an ebook on, I actually forgotten what it is. I think it's, habits of inclusion, right? How to create habits of inclusion, the psychology underpinning that.
Love it.
I'm on LinkedIn, Robin Rosenberg, psychologist. You'll find me. I'm the only psychologist who's Robin Rosenberg. Or Live in Their World is on LinkedIn. We're on Twitter.
So everywhere. And if you lift your phone up to that QR code, I know with the latest iPhone update, I think they made it easier, but it's more complicated for me because it's different. It's a change. But if you lift your camera, turn on your camera app on an Android or iPhone, and you hover over that QR code right by Robin, that should take you to her website, the Live in Their World website. So that's a great place to start. But definitely, as you've seen, Robin has so much to offer and so much to share and so much knowledge and wisdom. I highly recommend reaching out directly to Robin. So, Robin, we can't let you go yet, though, because we have a tradition here about giving homework and giving us something that we can do to move ahead with this conversation and make it work for us instead of just being inspired, which we're definitely inspired.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity I actually just don't like the term homework because for many people it sort of, harkens back to, did you do it or not? So I'm going to call it an experiment because it's about what did the data say? What happened when you tried and what do you learn from it?
Yeah.
Right? Because that's really sort of the field of science is about learning. Each experiment contributes to our learning and we can build on it. So I'm going to call it an experiment.
Okay.
And the idea is to try to put on your kind of most respectful, open, curious hat and set aside some time to talk to a colleague and just, ask them if you disagree about something is to ask them their perspective, really trying to understand. Preferably start with something about work. Let's not go into politics. But if you disagree about, something about work, it could be a little thing or a big thing, but just try the experiment of going in open and curious. And the goal is not to convince that person, but just to understand their perspective in a deeper way. Because usually what happens is that people are looking at the problem in different ways. And so they're coming up with different solutions.
Yeah.
And so or you may look at it the same way and disagree, and that's okay, but try that respectful engagement and see what happens. See if it deepens trust, see how it feels for you. You can ask them for feedback about how you approach them afterwards. Say, how was this for you? Is there anything I'm trying to do something different? Any feedback for me for learning? Just collect some data.
That's incredibly powerful because there's a lot of different layers to this. Not only are you stepping into the other person's feet in a way, but you're also stepping into a different role as a scientist, right? So you're asking them on their scientist hat. And if you do that, it should be a lot easier to let your guard down, because I know a lot of times when it comes to a disagreement, immediately it's like, nope, I'm right. And we put up those walls. But if you're a scientist really seeking out the truth, I think that exercise is right on, and something that I hope that all of you that are watching now or in the replay, that you try this and you report back to us. Let us know. These videos stay
Yes.
up and the comments keep coming in, so please report back to us.
Yes, that would be great. So we can collect data
Yeah,
about and learn how we can help you better.
excellent. Well, Robin, thank you so much for being here. This has
It's a pleasure.
been an amazing conversation. You're just maybe one of the most interesting people in the world, and I really appreciate you being here. And thank you all for tuning in, whether live or in the replay. Send us a message. Let us know that you were here, and do that experiment. It might teach you something, and it also might make the world a little bit of a better place if we all start doing that. So thank you
Thank-
all.
And
See
thanks for
you
having
next
me.
Wednesday.
Bye.